Welcome back to Bittersweet Dreams. I'm Dodge the Grave, and it's time for sleep. And let's begin. I See Her. Written by Anthony Lay, aka Darkheroxx. Clara and I met on a dating app, bonding over our love of the macabre. We've been talking for a few months, going on a few dates, watching scary movies, and drinking together. We weren't anything official, but we enjoyed each other's company. We were both growing tired of our jobs and decided to take some time off. We wanted to visit a place packed with fun, food, drinks, and especially spooky things. What better destination to visit than New Orleans? We coordinated our schedules and were able to plan a couple of days off. I can't tell you how excited we both were as the days passed and Friday finally arrived for us to leave. We got into my car and drove away for our little getaway that morning. We were in the bustling streets of the Big Easy a few hours later. This was the first time either of us had been here, and we were eager to absorb everything we could. Luckily, there was an Airbnb at this apartment in the heart of the city for our bargain price, and there was a parking garage across the street. The city is positively electrifying. The streets are thriving with people out having a good time. I was ready to take Clara and join the never-ending party. Our first challenge was to locate a parking spot. We finally arrived at the parking garage. It was not going to be simple to find a spot for my car. We ended up going round and around, ascending up and up in the building. We ended up on the 6th level, which was the garage roof. Our ears were filled with laughter, music, and celebration as soon as we stepped out of the car. I gathered our belongings, and we descended the elevator. I checked my phone to make sure I had everything I needed from our host. Everything went smoothly, and we turned up at our destination. Although it wasn't the fanciest hotel, I definitely got my money's worth. It was a small apartment on the complex's 10th floor. As soon as you walked in, there was a quaint kitchen, a living room with an old green sofa in front of a flat-screen TV, and the entrance to the bedroom, where a king-size bed adorned with purple and gold sheets greeted us. Clara hurried to the restroom to get ready for a night out, while I put our belongings aside. I went to the large windows and pulled back the drapes to see the rooftops and buildings outside. My black Ford Focus was parked on the parking garage's rooftop when I peered down. The open spaces were being swiftly filled by other automobiles, so I was happy to have gotten one. I was taking in every detail as I looked all about. The sun was lowering, and city lights started to gradually come on. I first noticed her then. On top of the parking garage, a female silhouette stood in front of a flickering light. She remained still while gazing at the cement rooftop guards. She caught my attention as I was looking down. I couldn't discern any distinguishing characteristics. Though she was only a black shadow, I could make out that she had long hair that hung down to her hips and moved with the wind. How long had she been there? She started to climb up the guard, and my heart started to beat faster. She started to creep closer to the brink, and my breath froze in my throat as I helplessly stared down. My body just reacted, and I jolted forward into the glass, shouting, "Fuck!" Clara screamed and bolted out of the bathroom. She looked at me with worry and asked me what was wrong. "This girl just jumped," I told her, and pointed towards the roof. She rushed to my side, and as we both peered out the window, there was nothing. I craned my neck over, dread filling my chest to see if there was a body splattered on the sidewalk. There was nothing. No trace of any gore, no bloody mess. No sign of any girl. I swore to Clara that I had seen a girl standing on the rooftop of the parking garage, and she was going to jump. She did jump. Clara groaned and punched my shoulder. "Don't scare me like that, you jerk," she grumbled as she returned to the bathroom to finish her makeup. I glanced back out the window, wondering if my eyes were just playing tricks on me. Half an hour later, we were both ready to head out into the night. We had plans for dinner at a restaurant on Jackson Square and to grab a few drinks at a bar on Frenchman Street. Everything was great, but I wasn't all there. The memory of that dark female shape slowly stepping over the edge kept flashing in my mind. I hoped that alcohol would drown out the thoughts in my head, but I couldn't enjoy the night. After a couple of cocktails, my stomach started to turn. I told Clara that we had to go back to the apartment because I wasn't feeling well. Disappointment flashed on her face, but she brushed it off after seeing the pathetic state I was in. We took an Uber back to our room. It was barely midnight when we both settled into bed. "Hey, I'm sorry about tonight," I told her, and she leaned over and kissed my cheek. "It's fine. We'll have fun tomorrow," she said. I let out a sigh of relief and closed my eyes to slowly drift off into sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night. My head felt heavy and there was a pressure on my eyes. Nature was calling, so I got up to go to the bathroom. As Clara was lightly snoring, I made sure not to do anything to wake her. Slowly and carefully, I groggily stepped through the darkness towards the toilet. After finishing my business, I stepped out to see Clara under the blankets. Her breathing was soft and soothing. She was illuminated by a dim light coming from the living room. I was very certain that everything was completely black just a second ago. I peered into the living room through the entryway of the bedroom. A little side table with a lamp on it was located on the other side of the couch. As soon as I focused my eyes on the bulb, its yellow light started to flicker. I approached the bulb after hearing a faint clicking sound. As I came closer, the lamp began to strobe faster and faster. When I eventually got there, I stood in pitch blackness. I remained there for a while, now fully awake, gazing forward at a curtain that covered another window. I was compelled to glance out the window. A growing surge of terror wrenched my chest. I reached out, gripping the thick fabric and pushing it aside. On top of the parking garage was a flickering white light. My car was there, along with a few others, and I quickly spotted what I was looking for. That terrible silhouette was standing on the edge of the roof, atop the cement guards, a black mass that appeared and vanished as the light turned on and off. I moved closer to the edge, centimeter by centimeter. I was entranced. My focus was fixed on the shape. I wanted to yell at her, to warn her not to do it. She was getting closer and closer to the edge. She was going to fall. Then she came to a halt, and her head snapped in an instant. I couldn't see her eyes. Although I was still unable to make out any facial features on her body, I can tell that she was looking directly at me. I suddenly came to my senses and jerked backwards. I screamed in terror as I landed on my ass, shuffling backwards away from the damn window. "What the hell?" Clara yelled as she dashed out of the bedroom. My whole body was drenched in cold sweat as I looked up at her. As I wiped my brow, my hands began to violently shake. I struggled for a minute to catch my breath. She asked what was wrong, and I told her I saw the girl outside again. She looked out the window and then back at me for a long moment. Clara saw nothing but cars and buildings outside. I could feel her annoyance as she moaned and got back into bed, so I gathered myself and settled down next to her. It took me a while, but when I was finally able to go back to sleep, I wished that I hadn't. In my unconscious state, I dreamt that I was on that roof. The spaces were completely empty, and I was utterly alone. I'm not sure why, but I was overcome with an unfathomable sadness. Tears were streaming down my face, and I could vividly feel the cold, rough concrete surface that I stood on with bare feet. I took a step forward. My body was moving on its own, and I used all my might to stop myself. I wasn't in control. I was just a passenger, trapped inside my own body as I helplessly felt myself lift up onto the edge of the roof. A cold breeze brushed my face, chilling the tears on my cheeks. I looked down onto the street. My heart was racing, beating against my ribs, wanting to burst out. My feet moved forward, and I begged God or whatever higher power to stop me. I took one big step onto empty air, and I immediately felt myself plummet down. I looked down, and the earth quickly became up. All I could hear was a rush of wind. My body fell at an incredible speed, and as my eyes came face to face with gray stone, I woke up. My eyes were wide open, and my entire body ached. I looked around and realized I was standing in front of the bedroom window. I knelt on my knees and sobbed quietly. I didn't want to wake Clara up, so I did my best to clean myself up without waking her. She didn't wake up until a few hours later. I put on a cheerful face and assured her that everything was fine. We went out for brunch after she had finished getting ready and enjoyed the festive atmosphere. I pretended to be normal for her, but a void was swirling inside of me. Despite the fact that I was surrounded by so many people, I felt so alone. I laughed when she laughed. I smiled when she smiled, and I pretended to be happy to make her happy. I went through the motions as easily as a mirror. Clara expressed her worry over my behavior yesterday, but I reassured her that I was fine. We did a tour, visited a couple of more restaurants, and hopped a few bars. She had fun while I pushed the girl and the dream to the very back of my mind. Inside my body, I was struggling to make it through the day. The long hours had passed, and it was already 2 a.m. We returned to the apartment and crashed onto the bed. She kissed my forehead and thanked me for an amazing day. I forced a smile at her and told her we had more days to come. Checkout was at 11 a.m., so we decided to turn in. We lay on the bed, back to back, and I stared towards the window. When I heard her rhythmic breaths, I got up and looked out the window. My gaze instantly turned to the rooftop. My car was still parked in its spot, a few new cars in the other spaces, and the single white light flickered over the elevator. There was no sign of the girl at all. I closed the curtain and opened it again, like turning a television on and off in hopes of seeing that girl, but she wasn't there. Why wasn't she there? Was she done with me? I started to feel anxious, and I don't know why, but I ran out of the apartment. As soon as I stepped outside, I was greeted by a deafening silence. The sound of the city, people, and cars were all gone. I ignored my sense of unease and continued to the parking garage. I hurried to the ground floor elevator, pressing the call button furiously. The mechanical groans could be heard from inside, but the doors did not open. Screw it, I muttered to myself as I walked uphill. The roof was on the 6th level, and as I ascended, so many thoughts began to race through my mind. My job sucks. I'm not making enough money. This whole trip was a waste of time and money. My legs hurt from all the walking. Clara doesn't love me. Clara doesn't understand me. She doesn't want me. No one wants a fucking loser like me. I stepped onto the 6th floor, and I looked around frantically. Where is the girl? Where is she? She is the only one that understands the sadness I feel. The light began to flicker erratically, and I caught glimpses of the girl. She was no longer a silhouette. At that moment, I could see her so clearly. She stood there, stark naked. She was tall, maybe 5'11", with long limbs. She had the body of a dancer. No, she looked like a fairy to me. Her eyes were as dark as her long raven hair, empty yet inviting. Her skin was extremely pale. It reminded me of a canvas as I noticed streaks of crimson blood all over her. She took small steps backwards, her bones cracking with every move, and I moved forward with her. She outstretched her right arm to me, bones jutting out of her skin and fingers broken. In turn, I reached out to her, wanting to feel her. Every negative thought I had, the feeling of failure, the emptiness of being unloved, the void inside of me was being replaced with the thought of touching her. She was over the edge, and I met her gaze as I stepped onto the guard. Her eyes were pure black, empty yet inviting. She smiled to reveal jagged, broken teeth, and blood trickled down her scalp. She wanted me to hold her hands and dance with her as she stood in the air. This beautiful, broken girl stood in front of me. She was death, and she wanted to be embraced by me. All I needed to do was take one step closer to her. If I just go to her, the pain inside my heart will go away. She is the only person who understands me. She cherishes me. A gust of wind hit me in the face as I lifted my leg to move forward. I was reminded of my dream about falling. I remembered the fear I felt as I remembered my body rushing to the street. I started crying. This time, I was in control of my body, and everything in me was screaming for me to move forward. Then something grabbed my leg. I looked down to see Clara. Her expression was twisted with fear and pain. She hadn't removed her makeup, so black streaks ran down her cheeks. "Please, don't do it," she begged, tightening her hold on my leg. When I returned my gaze to the girl, reality hit me. Her beautiful face had turned into a monster in my eyes. I stumbled backwards as she opened her mouth in a silent scream. My ears were ringing and my head ached. Clara's curries sounded muffled and I felt dizzy. The words escaped my lips. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm so..." Everything faded to black. When I awoke, I found myself in a hospital bed. I looked to see a teary-eyed Clara tightly gripping my hand. She released me and wiped her eyes. "You fucking idiot! Why would you do that?" I rested my head back. My skull was split, and I could tell from the bandages that were tightly wound on me. "I'm sorry," was all I could say. I told her about all of my insecurities and everything that I felt. I told her that I felt like I wanted to die, and she grabbed my face and kissed my lips. I love you. Of course I fucking love you, she snapped at me. I was released from the hospital after I had recovered a little more. We returned to the room, packed our belongings, and climbed back onto the roof to reach my car. I gave her the keys because she insisted on driving. Promise me. Promise me that when we get back, you'll get some help, she said, grabbing my hand. I leaned against the window, and in the car's side mirror, I noticed not only my reflection, but also the black shape of a girl sitting in the back seat. Yeah, I promise I'll get some help, I replied quietly. My brother is the one to blame. Written by Darkheroxx, aka Anthony Lay. I used to look up to my older brother. Matt was smart, handsome, athletic, and the kindest person you'll ever meet. Everyone wanted to be him, and all the girls wanted to be with him. Matt truly had it all. That was until he met her, his girlfriend Samantha. They started dating in their senior year of high school, the two most popular kids at school who were meant to be. He was in love with her, and he spent every waking moment attending to her every need. His love soon turned into a sick obsession. Matt and Samantha set out for a university a few cities away. My family and I hadn't heard from him in months, but we assumed he was simply preoccupied with college. It was nearing the end of spring when the whole world flipped upside down. I'll never forget coming home from school and seeing my parents seated at the kitchen table. My mother was crying her eyes out, while my father sat there, blankly staring at my mother's phone. Mom? What's going on? I asked reluctantly. My mother tried to compose herself, but ended up crying even harder. My father cleared his throat, and with a wavering voice he said, "Your brother." He paused for a moment to think over his next few words. "Something happened to your brother." My heart sank when the words left his mouth. I thought that Matt had died, but after hearing what happened, I wished that he did. Samantha's friends had noticed that she hadn't been to her classes and had gone to check on her. She shared a small apartment with Matt near campus, and when they arrived, they could hear sobbing from inside. There was no response after knocking several times and calling out Matt and Samantha's names. Their concerns grew by the second, so after a few more failed attempts, they eventually called the police. When the cops arrived, they were able to force the door open, and inside the once happy lovers' home was a scene from a horror movie. Pictures of the couple were strewn across the floor, furniture was toppled, and crying could be heard from the bedroom. The officers on the scene found my brother covered in blood, hunched over Samantha's corpse, and her abdomen had countless stab wounds. He was quickly arrested, and the police conducted a very thorough investigation of what happened. Inside Samantha's phone and laptop were a collection of evidence of Matt's abuse towards her. There were pictures of bruises and cuts on her body, along with detailed descriptions, along with timestamps of what he did to her. She talked about how he would get jealous of her talking to other men, and how angry he would get when she would try to have a moment away from him. She went on to say that he had repeatedly threatened to kill her if she even considered leaving him. The worst part was a video. A hidden camera in their bedroom captured a horrifying assault scene. Throughout the interrogation, Matt was almost catatonic, refusing to answer any of the police's questions. My parents pleaded with him to explain his actions, but he remained deafeningly silent. The love for my brother turned into scorn. One by one, the people around him expressed their hate for him, calling him a murderer and wishing for him to be put down. My family tried to support him despite what the public thought of us, but it was a heavy weight that was slowly crushing us. My parents became the people that gave birth to a monster, and I was the little brother to a demon. I used to look up to my brother, but I wished every single day that he would just disappear. The investigation eventually came to an end. They gathered all of the evidence, and they were ready for the trial. My parents went to great lengths to find the best lawyer for my brother's case. After a tense week, it was determined that Matt, well, he was innocent. They ruled out suicide, but how could someone do that to themselves? Despite all of the evidence, my brother was able to flee freely. I couldn't believe it. I had prayed so desperately for Matt to be arrested, to be held accountable for his actions. As I watched Samantha's parents cry in front of me, tears welled up in my eyes. Matt just stood there, staring as Samantha's father cursed him to go to hell. After that, we simply went home, and Matt had since locked himself in his room. He stopped attending school and refused to leave the house. A few years had passed since then, and I was preparing to start college while Matt continued his exile in his bedroom. After all this time, I would barely see him, even though we lived under the same roof, and his room was across the hall from mine. My parents still felt the need to take care of him, so they would always leave food outside his door. Every now and then, they would ask me to go check in on him, but there would be no response. There was just silence beyond that door. I thought that he died, but late at night, I would hear him leave his room to use the restroom and clean up a bit. I felt disappointment each time I heard his footsteps go through the house. One night, I caught a glimpse of him. I only saw his silhouette in the dark hallway. He seemed to have gotten a lot skinnier since the last time I saw him. I recall hearing a low whisper coming from his room. I was surprised because it had been so long since I had heard him speak that I had forgotten how he sounded. I should have said something to him at the time, but he ran back into his room. The creaking of the wooden floor, followed by the click of the lock, seemed to reverberate throughout the house. Even if it was only for a fraction of a second, seeing my brother reminded me of Samantha and made me sick to my stomach. A couple of days after that encounter, my parents sat me down on the couch to tell me they were going to leave for a few days. Of course, that wasn't an issue until they asked me to make sure that Matt was being taken care of. Just make sure he eats and, just check in on him, my mother pleaded. I agreed, but I was nervous thinking about being home alone with that man. It was a Friday when my parents left. They were going to be gone until Monday. It was just a few days of being home alone with Matt. That night, I ordered some pizza and quickly devoured a couple of slices before setting a few on a plate to bring to Matt. On my way, I noticed that his bedroom door was cracked open. I slowly took a few steps closer. It was pitch black inside of his room. I strained my eyes to try and peek through the darkness when a pale, gaunt face emerged. I jumped, and the paper plate I had in my hand fell to the floor. I looked down to see the mess I had made, and looked back to see that Matt's door was closed. Fuck, man. I cursed under my breath as I set the food back onto the paper plate. I left and came back with a new plate of food and placed it on the side of his door. I knocked on Matt's door and called out, "Hey, I brought you some food. Just eat when you want, I guess." I expected to hear silence, but I could hear whispering coming from inside of his room. I decided to leave him alone and went straight to my room. I spent the rest of the night lying in bed, listening to music until I fell asleep. That night, I dreamt of Matt's white mask-like face staring at me from the end of my bed. The next day went by like normal. I got some errands done, talked with some friends, and played some video games. It wasn't until that night that I noticed that the plate of food I had set aside for Matt last night was left untouched outside his door. I called out to him, "Matt, you should eat." I stood there for a moment, but there was no response. Then I knocked on his door, and when my fist made contact with the wooden panel, it slowly pushed it open. I could hear crying from somewhere inside his bedroom's darkness. As I called out, "Matt?" I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I pressed my hand against the cold wall until I found the light switch. Before I could turn on the light, I felt a hand grab my wrist. Matt's face was barely illuminated by the light from behind me as he stared at me with a terrified expression on his face. I was close enough to see the outline of his cheekbones beneath his pale skin. His hair was a tangled mess that flowed down the side of his head, and his eyes were bloodshot. His face twisted from fear to pain as he let out an agonized wail. "I'm sorry," he screamed, and I looked in horror as a set of pale hands grabbed his shoulders to pull him backwards into the dark. My heart sank into my stomach, and I quickly retreated to slam the door shut. I couldn't comprehend what I had just seen. I thought to myself that it was probably my eyes playing tricks on me. I snapped out of my thoughts when I heard Matt whispering inside his room. "I'm sorry. I won't do it again. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry." As much as I hated my brother, something inside of me was telling me to help him. Matt continued to whisper, and each apology was grating in my ears. Something felt horribly wrong. So I took a deep breath and opened the door. I remembered where the light switch was, and I reached out and flipped it. The light turned on and immediately started to flicker. Within the strobing light, I could see Matt curled into a ball on the floor with something hovering over him. It was a woman, or rather, something shaped like a woman. It was so skinny that I could make out each bone underneath its light gray skin. It was completely nude, and I saw that its stomach was ripped open to reveal its exposed insides. The woman looked up and stared at me with large white eyes. It had a smile that showed its sharp teeth. It opened its mouth, and a large forked tongue writhed out of its maw. Mine. Mine. A high-pitched, distorted voice croaked out of its throat. Its small hands grabbed Matt and lifted him to his feet. I began to shake in fear as it took its tongue and licked up and down his neck. Mine. Mine. It wailed again. Get out of here, Matt screamed, breaking me out of my stupor. I looked at him, and I was reminded of the brother that I once loved, that somewhere deep inside I still loved. The lights continued to flicker around us, and I could hear something thud onto the floor. The woman's intestines were slithering on the ground, slowly wrapping itself around Matt's leg and crawling up his body. She took her arms and pulled him into an embrace. She didn't care about me. All she wanted was my brother. I didn't know what to do. I rushed forward without a thought in my mind as I clutched her rotten intestine and pulled it to set Matt free. His body began to lift up and, in an instant, came slamming onto the floor. The intestine retracted back into the woman's body as she quickly stepped to me. I tried to take a step back, but her hand grabbed a fistful of hair on the back of my head. She pulled my face to hers, and I finally realized that this monster, was Samantha. She opened her mouth, and I was hit with a decaying stench as she shouted, Mine! She opened her mouth wider and wider. Her sharp teeth seemed to go on endlessly as she opened her mouth around my head. Slowly, she began to bite down, the ends of her fangs slowly piercing my skin. My skull felt the pressure of her teeth effortlessly sinking into it. Stop it. Just take me, Matt whispered at our feet. My gaze went down to see him grabbing her ankle. Just end it, please, he said. She removed her mouth from my head and bent down to look at Matt. She let out a terrible squeal of delight as she began to sink her hands into his chest. Blood began to spray out of his open torso, and he screamed. His screams were so horrible as she slowly, carefully removed his beating heart. She stood up and stared at the throbbing organ in her hands, her eyes upturned into glee. She took a free hand and stabbed it into her chest. The sound of her ribs snapping filled my ears. I watched as it took Matt's heart and forcefully thrust it into the open hole in her chest. Samantha began to let out a discordant moan as the hole in her chest closed. Her abdomen began to seal with new flesh, and her gray skin began to regain color. Her body twisted and morphed back into the visage of the Samantha I had seen when she was alive. She looked at me and back down at Matt. She smiled. Even though the face was different, I recognized the monster I saw before. All mine, she said in a cutesy voice, and as I blinked, She was gone. Samantha was gone, and the mess of blood that filled the room had disappeared. The light stopped flickering, and it was only me and Matt's corpse in the room. I fell to my knees beside my dead brother, and I just cried. That was when I noticed a stack of papers underneath my brother's bed, and I pulled them out. The papers were details of what had actually happened between Matt and Samantha. The whole story was twisted, and it revealed that Matt wasn't the obsessive one. It was Samantha. She was the one that threatened him if he would leave, and he was the one that felt powerless to her demands. The video of the assault was a complete fabrication. She forced him to do those things to her while she threatened to hurt the people around him. Her stab wounds were self-inflicted after he finally told her that he was leaving her. Matt felt trapped by her, in life and in her death. My brother kept the truth to himself, despite all of the hate, because he still truly loved her, her real self. The true monster would have shattered her family, so my brother took the blame. Samantha took everything from my brother, and even after she died, she continued to take from him. I regret everything. Just like everyone else around him, I jumped to conclusions. I wish I would have taken the time to reach out to him, but now he's gone. I'm left with an empty inside of me that's created from the things I'll never get to say to him again. My brother took the blame for everything, and he did it out of love. She Needed Help. Written by Darkheroxx. I'd been living in my quaint two-bedroom apartment for a few years, and nothing out of the ordinary had occurred until a new tenant moved into the unit next to mine. This all happened a couple of months ago, as I was leaving for work in the morning to see someone carrying a couple of cardboard boxes in the cramped hallway of my apartment building. Hello? Do you mind giving me a hand, please? A soft female voice called out from behind the boxes. I dashed over to relieve her of some of the weight of the boxes. "Whoa, I got you," I assured her. Whatever she was carrying was heavy, and I was surprised she could carry it up the stairs without aid in the first place. We shuffled awkwardly to the door of the unit next to mine. "I'm so sorry about this. Just give me a second to..." Her words trailed off, followed by the rattling sound of keys. She took a step back into the doorway and guided me through. "Let's just leave it here." She spoke in a strained tone. We set the boxes down in unison, my back already cursing me for doing something so strenuous so early in the morning. When I stood up, I was awestruck to see one of the most beautiful women I'd ever seen. Her fair skin accentuated her cute freckles. Her long blonde hair was tied into a bun, and she looked at me with blue eyes that put the sky to shame. "A couple down. A few more to go," she sighed. The young woman glanced at me and quickly composed herself, wiping her hands on her t-shirt, then reaching out for a handshake. "Thank you so much. My name is Madison, but call me Maddie," she said as she gave a warm smile. I shrugged off the pain coming from my lower back and gave her my most welcome greeting. Hey, I'm Ben. Looks like we're going to be neighbors, I said as I awkwardly shook her hand. Oh, God, what a great first impression, she said in a dejected tone. Your helpless new neighbor is already being a bother. I snapped back. Oh, no, not at all. It's early, so yeah, it's no problem at all. We both laughed for a moment until I realized I really needed to get to work. Hey, so I'm just over there, I said, as I pointed to the direction of my unit. If you need anything, just, give me a knock. She grinned. Yeah, for sure. I felt a chill on my lower back as I walked towards the front door. I quickly turned around to see Maddie lifting some things out of one of the boxes. I felt a little uneasy, but dismissed it as nerves from talking to her. See you soon, she said as I shut the door behind me. I couldn't think of anything else for the rest of the day. Before I knew it, the day had passed, and it was evening as I walked up the stairs to my apartment. I paused for a moment as I walked past her apartment. I wanted to tap on her door and ask if she needed anything, perhaps some help with something. Idiot, I muttered to myself as I smacked my forehead with my palm. Don't be creepy. Thankfully, my logic went out and I was able to return home. The rest of my night I sat on my couch, staring blankly at something on TV, wishing she would knock on my door. I jolted out of a deep sleep in the middle of the night. As I slowly sat up, I realized I dozed off on my couch. My living room was dark, except for the dim light from my TV, which had the words, "Are you still watching?" displayed across the screen. A sharp pain in my neck made me wince as I groggily lifted myself off the couch. I let out a yawn and then heard something that made me hold the breath in my throat. A muffled but clearly audible sobbing filled the space around me. I grabbed my phone from the coffee table to check it, but it only showed the time at 2 a.m. I followed the sound which led me to the wall. The crying was coming from the other side, from Maddie's apartment. I pressed an ear onto the cold surface of the wall and strained to listen. The sobbing sounded high-pitched, not like a woman, but more like a child's. The sobs started to get louder, as if whoever it was crying directly into my ear. "It hurts," the child's voice whispered. I pushed myself off the wall and stumbled backwards. My whole body suddenly felt cold as I stared at the wall. The crying was gone. Was I dreaming? Did I really hear something? I clutched at my chest to get my heart to calm down. I quickly stepped to my bedroom and stayed awake for a while longer until fatigue took over. The following morning, the alarm from my phone woke me up. The sunlight pierced through the window blinds and made me wince. I felt exhausted, as if I had only closed my eyes for a split second. I prepared for work, all the while thinking about the crying coming from Maddie's apartment. Maybe she has a kid or something, I muttered to myself. As I stepped out of my unit, I made my way down the stairs to find Maddie standing at the base. "Hey, neighbor," she said cheerily. "Headed to work?" I gave her a smile as I shyly answered, Yep." As I met her at the bottom of the stairwell, I couldn't resist the urge to ask, "Hey, are you okay?" She looked confused. "What do you mean?" she asked. Anxiety started to wash over me as I thought about how weird I was for even asking her. "I just thought I heard something coming from your apartment last night." "Oh, I guess I had the TV on too loud. Sorry about that," she said. Thinking rationally, of course it was a show or something playing. No. Sorry for being weird," I said. She gave me a reassuring smile as she punched my shoulder. It's an apartment. There's all kinds of noises going on, I guess. She began to walk up the stairs, then paused to turn to me. This is going to sound even weirder, but after I get settled, would you like to come over for dinner? My response was a barely coherent, stuttered yes that made her laugh. I spent the rest of the day completely elated. The idea of dinner with Maddie was the only thing that preoccupied my mind. After work, I parked my car in its usual spot within my apartment complex. As I got out, I heard a familiar voice from a parking space nearby. "Shit," they exclaimed. Curious, I walked over to see none other than Maddie carrying some plastic grocery bags with a couple of them in a pile next to her. I ran over to help her pick up some of her groceries, and she apologized profusely as she walked up to her place. She fumbled with the bags and her keys as she got her door open, which I thought was extremely cute. When the door opened, I was hit with a sudden rush of cold air. "Jesus," I shouted as a chill ran down my spine. "What's wrong?" she asked. I was going to comment on the cold, but it was gone in an instant. "It's nothing." "Where do you want these?" I asked. I followed her to the kitchen, and I even helped her with putting up her groceries. "Thanks for helping me out," she said. "Oh, it's nothing at all," I assured her. "So, since you're here, would you like some wine?" My response was a lightning-fast yes. Maddie instructed me to relax on the couch while she finished putting up the rest of the groceries. With a glass of wine in hand, I stepped over to the other room. My heart was racing as I sat nervously in her living room. I looked around as she told me how happy she was to have her couch delivered that day, and other ongoings with her move. There were cardboard boxes everywhere, and near one of them were a small pile of picture frames. I moved from the couch and bent down near the pictures to inspect them. The frames were held images of Maddie with a young girl. I shuffled through the rest of the frames to find more pictures of her and this young girl. She had bushy blonde hair, blue eyes similar to Maddie's, and a big smile in each of the pictures. "What are you doing?" Maddie's voice made me jump. I turned to see her standing with a wine glass in one hand and a bottle in the other. I saw these picture frames and was just curious. I trailed off and asked, "Is this your kid?" Maddie's face twisted into a sad expression, and she took a deep sip of wine. "Yeah, that's Lydia." "Was she the one I heard crying last night?" "Oh, does she not stay with you?" I asked. She winced a bit, as if my words slapped her. Her dad and I had a lot of issues, and she's with him, actually. I felt remorse from my question. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't be asking questions like that." She took another sip of wine before telling me that everything is fine. I finished the remnants of wine in my glass and excused myself to the restroom. All of these apartments had a similar floor plan, so I stepped into the hallway. I easily found the bathroom and splashed some cold water on my face. The air felt so heavy after talking about her daughter, and I felt like an idiot for prying. I took a long breath before shutting out the light and moved into the hallway. That's when I saw something that made me freeze in my tracks. At the other end of the hallway was a darkened shape of a young child. It stood there with its head tilted all the way to its right side. After my eyes adjusted to the dark silhouette, I was able to make out the faint features of its face. It was Maddie's daughter. She turned her head upright, and it made a sickening, cracking noise. She began to creep towards me, each step making that nauseating cracking sound. I took a few steps back. My whimpers of fear were stuck in my throat as she grew closer. She moved into one of the bedrooms, and the door slowly creaked closed behind her. My eyes were fixated on that door for a moment, until Maddie called out to ask if I was okay. I quickly stepped past the room and made my way back to where Maddie was. I blurted out, "Are you sure you're living alone?" Her face twisted from concern to anger as she questioned me. "Why are you asking me that?" I felt cold sweat coming from my skin. "I just saw your daughter walking around in the hallway, and there was something wrong with her." "That's not possible," she said with a stern voice. "She's not here. She's with her dad, like I told you." My neck suddenly began to ache, and I started to feel that cold sensation on my lower back. "Get the hell out of my apartment," she said. At that moment, I could hear that child's crying echoing in my skull. It was so loud I clasped my hands over my ears in an attempt to shield from the crying, but it grew louder and more hysterical. "Get out of my apartment," Maddie screamed. I shouted out, "God, go help your daughter. She won't stop crying." Then everything went silent. I slowly lifted my head to look at her, and the once beautiful face I'd so desperately wanted to see again was filled with such an intense rage. "What did you say?" she whispered. I didn't know how to respond until she started to walk towards me. I made sure she wasn't going to cry anymore. Maddie took her wine glass with both hands and cracked it to leave its stem. She pointed the broken stem in my direction. Its jagged edges were aimed at my neck. Maddie lunged at me, but I was able to step away. Without thinking, I ran into the hallway towards one of the bedrooms and slammed the door behind me. I stood there in the pitch darkness of the room while Maddie was pounding her fists on the other side of the door. "Get out! Get out!" she screamed with all her might. My focus shifted, as within the dark room I could hear that cracking sound followed by the girl's cries. "It hurts. It hurts," she cried. Something was horribly wrong, but I couldn't leave the kid here with this crazy woman. "It's okay. It's going to be okay. I'll call the police, okay?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone to turn it on. My phone screen was bright, and its dim light filled my small corner of the room. Positioned in front of my phone was the girl. She stood there staring at me. Her head was tilted completely over her right shoulder. Her neck was completely broken. Bloody tears streamed down her face as she cried. "It hurts. Mommy, it hurts." Then she placed a hand on top of mine that sent a shock through me. My vision was filled with images of Maddie and a man arguing. Then my vision shifted to her raising her hand over her head to bring down a fist. I could feel the hot impact on my face as darkness overtook my sight. I felt myself lying in a bed with my eyes stinging from crying so much. I could hear Maddie and the man arguing again, and the man screaming, "Put the knife down, Madison." Then there was an eerie silence. I could hear a door open, and I felt a weight press on top of me. My neck started to ache. That familiar pain I felt earlier. "Shh, shh, shh. Stop crying," I heard Maddie whisper in my ear. I felt the weight of her forearm press onto my neck as a sharp, cold pain pierced my lower back. My vision snapped back, and I was standing in the center of the dark room I had trapped myself in. I heard the door slowly creak behind me, and Maddie whispered under her breath, "There's no more crying. No one's going to cry anymore." I heard her quickened footsteps head towards me, and I turned to kick her. I yelled as she stabbed a broken wine glass stem into my leg, and I fell backwards. She shuffled towards me like a maddened animal and pulled the glass out of my leg. Maddie repositioned herself on top of me, and with the light from my phone, I could see the crazed expression of a killer. Tears began to pour out of my eyes when I came to the realization that she was going to silence me like her child. I blinked, and I saw that right beside her was her daughter. She wrapped her arms around Maddie, who was frozen in fear. "What's this? What's going on? Why am I so cold?" she shouted. Maddie couldn't see her dead child clutching at her, attempting to stop her movements. "No more, Mommy. No more crying," she hissed. She reached for her hands and moved them to her throat. "Wait, what's going on? Stop!" Maddie yelled, as the glass she was clutching in her hand was nearing impact. I stood there watching as the sharp edge pierced her skin and blood poured out of the hole in her neck. She started crying, but her sobs turned into gurgles as the crimson blood poured out of her. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and she collapsed onto the floor. The pain in my neck was relieved as the girl slowly turned her head towards me. The sharp chill on my lower back had vanished, and before I could react, she was gone. I slowly picked up my phone and eventually dialed 911. I was attacked and defended myself against a woman who murdered her child. I just wish I, or someone, had helped that little girl sooner. I'm Not Going Anywhere, Baby. Written by Darkheroxx. It has been a little over 8 years since my dad died. We were so close. I was always his little girl, despite being such a rotten kid. Whenever I rebelled or lashed out, he would always approach me with a warm smile. He'd be there to make sure I went back on the right path. He'd ruffle my hair, tell corny dad jokes, and bring me my favorite snacks whenever I had a bad day. When someone broke my heart, he'd be there to give me a hug and assure me that I was much better than what I thought I was. My dad was my hero, and not once did I ever think that anything would happen to him. That was until his tall and heavy frame turned frail and skinny. His loud laughter was replaced with wet coughs, and his bright blue eyes became cloudy. My mom and I were a wreck, but just as he stayed by my side through the tough times, I stayed by his. Even as he was on that hospital bed, hooked up to all sorts of machines, he would ruffle my hair and tell me one of his corny jokes. The days he was at the hospital felt like months, and with each passing moment, he was getting worse. The day finally came when his condition had become critical and he was beyond any help. I was there as his life was flickering out. I gripped his hand as he gave me a smile. I begged him to stay with me. I told him that I wouldn't be able to make it through this without him. A tear ran down his cheek as he wiped away mine, and he told me, "I'm not going anywhere, baby." The days that followed just didn't seem real. As the day of the funeral came, I just wished that everything was a really long dream. As I sat there at the front row, near my dad's open casket, I listened to my uncle give the eulogy. I couldn't cry anymore. Hell, I couldn't feel anymore. My uncle's words, along with the constant barrage of condolences from others, became muffled static in my ears. I couldn't do much but lock myself up in my room for a while as my mom tried her best to go on as a single parent to a teenager. In my deep depressive sleep, I had dreams of my dad standing at the foot of my bed, watching over me. He looked as he was when he was alive and healthy. He flashed me that warm smile of his. I called out to him, telling him how much I missed him and how much I needed him to stay. He would place a hand on my cheek and tell me, "I'm not going anywhere, baby." When I would wake, I could still feel the warmth of his hand on my face. And that morning, I caught my mom before she went to work, and she pulled me in for a hug. "I think about him all the time, too," she would whisper in my ear. When she released me from her embrace, I nearly jumped when I saw a familiar face behind her. My dad was standing right behind my mom with a smile on his face. I stood there in complete awe as my mom gathered her things and walked straight through him. She said her goodbye and told me she would be home a bit late that night, but my attention was completely fixed on my dad. I didn't know what to do or say. The only thought in my mind was that I had snapped and began hallucinating. I opened my mouth, but all that came out were high-pitched squeaks and unintelligible jumble of words. Dad let out a chuckle, and the words that came next made me break down and cry. "I'm not going anywhere, baby." If I was hallucinating, then so be it. The next few days, I would see my dad wander around the house. He didn't do much else besides walk around and watch over us. When I would speak to him, he would just smile and say that he wasn't going anywhere. It made me so happy. I didn't care as long as I could see him. It helped ease my mind, especially when I caught my mom crying to herself in the living room. My dad was standing in a corner watching her. I was absolutely sure that I was the only one that could see him. I sat down next to my mom and told her as I held her that Dad was watching over us. We sat there and cried for a while. Then I felt my dad's hand ruffle my hair. Things got better. I was able to go back to school, and Mom was able to make ends meet with the promotion at work. As time went on, the happiness in seeing my dad every day had started to wane. A year had passed, and seeing him just wander around the home would wrench at my heart a bit. All he did was walk around for a bit, stand for a moment, and stare. When I would talk to him, he would ruffle my hair sometimes, but he would always say the same thing. Actually, it was the only thing he would say. "I'm not going anywhere, baby." I started to feel sorry for him. Another year passed. I was 18 years old and getting ready to graduate high school. I was preparing to go off to university, and Mom had found a boyfriend. I was happy she was moving on, but it made me really sad to see my dad just staring at them as they sat on the couch together. Maybe that's what started the changes. I'm not quite sure. Dad had started to move a bit slower around the house. I was still the only one able to see him. One day, I followed him around, and his movements were so robotic. I never noticed it at first. Maybe it was looking in rose-colored glasses, but the color of his skin had started to dull. I'd call out to him every now and then, and he would turn his lips into a grin and would say his phrase like he always would. A few months after, I was packed up and ready to go to college. My mom was sobbing, and her boyfriend was wishing me good luck. I reassured them that I would be back as soon as I could, and I looked behind them into the house to see my dad, now sitting on the floor just staring at us, at me. I said, "I love you," and I could see his lips move. I knew what he was saying already. More time had passed. College was amazing, and I was completely transfixed on my new life. Every now and then, I would remember my dad and wonder if he was still there. As soon as I had gotten my schedule situated, I would rush home as soon as I could. My mom would give me her biggest hug, and her boyfriend, who was promoted to fiancé, welcomed me with a big, awkward smile. My mom assured me that she had left my room exactly how I left it. I thanked her and ran straight to it. As soon as I opened the door, I let out a yelp. I had almost forgotten. I almost forgot my dad until I saw him sitting on my bed. He looked up and stared at me. He looked different. A lot different. He looked so thin. I could see his bones through his pale, bruised skin. I was just shocked to see him. He didn't look good. He stood up and slowly shuffled towards me. I was completely frozen like a deer in front of headlights. The closer he got, the more I could see that the once warm soul I had seen had turned cold and gaunt. As he inched closer, I could feel the air turn frigid, and for a moment, I thought I could see my quivering breath between us. I could smell him. the smell of rot slowly filling the space around us. "Dad?" I forced the words out of my throat, and he lifted his hand to reveal long, bony fingers that tightly gripped the top of my head. He moved his face close to mine, and I saw that his eyes were gone. The sockets were filled with empty black voids. His mouth cracked and popped as he opened it to say those words that used to give me comfort. "I'm not going anywhere, baby." His breath hit my face, and it was so foul I forcibly swallowed the vomit that tried to escape from me. He slowly crept past me, and I could hear his footsteps thud behind me towards the living room. I quickly rushed to the bathroom, and I just let everything out of me as I threw up into the toilet. My mom rushed over to check on me, but I just told her that I must have eaten something bad. That night, Mom was planning the rest of my stay, but I told her that something had come up and that I had to go back to the university. She was sad, but she understood that I must have been really busy. I couldn't tell her that the ghost of my dad had been haunting the home and he was slowly turning into something else. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him like that again. I couldn't help but think that it was all my fault. After that, I just didn't go back. I spent a few years away from that home until I graduated college. I had gotten an apartment, a really good job, and my mom had finally gotten remarried. We were both moving on with our lives and doing pretty well. I had gotten a message one day that she had packed things up and was moving into a new house. She had left my things alone and asked me to handle that. I told her it wasn't an issue, so I cleared up a weekend to head over to our old family home. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't afraid of going back. I spent so long avoiding that place since that one day, and I hoped that it was all some sort of weird, trippy memory. I parked my car in the driveway and stepped to the front door. My mom and her husband were getting their new home situated, so I was all alone. Rather, I hoped I was alone. I opened the door and was met with darkness. Despite it being a warm afternoon, the house felt dark and cold. I went inside and closed the door behind me. I brushed my hands along the wall to feel for the light switch. The wall, this house, felt so damn cold. My fingers started to feel numb. Then I finally felt the switch and flicked the lights to life. Mom had really made quick work. The house was pretty much completely empty. I took small steps towards the hallway where my room was, but froze in my tracks when I heard something thump. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded like something had dropped. I held my breath and focused on the noise. Thump, thump. My body started to shake, not sure from fear or the cold. Thump, thump, thump. Something was on the floor. Something was on the floor, and it was coming towards me. Thump, 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 thump. Whatever it was fucking fast. The only thought that blared in my mind was to get out of there. I turned my attention to the front door and sprinted towards it. I placed my hand on the doorknob and turned it until my legs were pulled from underneath me. My head slammed into the door. Then my upper body came crashing onto the floor. I tried to get up, but whatever held me by my ankles began to drag me across the room. I screamed as I was helpless to whatever had me in its clutches. I dug my fingers into the vinyl flooring to try and impede it. I kicked wildly until it finally let me go. I was like a frantic animal as I crawled to the front door. My whole body was aching. Then a deep and guttural voice erupted from behind me, causing a frozen jolt down my spine. Not going anywhere. I turned. I so stupidly turned around to see what my dad had turned into. The thing that was my dad had long limbs that stretched upwards to a joint, then dropped down to his hand, and felt like some kind of human-like spider. The body was now covered in purple, rotten flesh. Its mouth was wide open to reveal jagged, yellow teeth, a wriggling forked tongue, and black bile oozing onto the floor. His face was so skeletal and his eye sockets were so massive. Most of his rotten, peeling face was 2 black holes for eyes. Its body was shaking. No, its visage was morphing like static, as if it was struggling to stay here. It tilted its head, and its neck made a noise that sounded like maggots were crawling inside of it. I cried and yelled for it to go away, to return to the depths of my mind, or to cross over to the other side. Whatever it took for it to just fucking go away. It crawled over to me. It was so fast that I couldn't even react. He was over me, and I was on the ground, curled into a ball. All I could do was look up at him in absolute terror. Please, I'm sorry. Just move on. I cried out to him, but my words fell upon deaf ears. It took one of its long, spindly limbs and placed a disgusting, decaying hand upon my cheek. Not go. Not go. Not go. Not go. It said over and over as it rubbed its fingers on my cheek. I thought it was going to pull my skin off of my face. It pressed its nails on my face and slowly raked them up to my hair. I felt blood starting to pour out of me. I just cried more from the pain. It seemed to notice as it tilted its head in confusion. It then took a hand and began to dig into its other arm. The squish and tearing of flesh filled my ears. I looked up at it to see that it had removed a chunk of meat from itself, and it pressed it up to my lips. I shook my head to avoid its disgusting meat away from me, and it let out an angry scream. It was more of a beast's howl. And I closed my eyes tight, and I tried calling out to him again. Dad, I'm sorry, but it's okay now. Things are better, and you need to move on now. We moved on. We're okay. I didn't hear anything. There was a long, dead silence. I opened my eyes and saw that it was gone. I slowly picked myself up to see that it was in a corner just staring at me with its black void for eyes. It howled again. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not going anywhere, baby. I broke down and cried as I looked at him, really looked at him, and said, "It's okay. You can go now." As quickly as he appeared, he was suddenly gone. No trace of him was left besides me, standing alone in the middle of our old home, bloodied and bruised. It was okay, though. I was ready to go on. I was ready for a long time now. The dark, cold air that surrounded the place was now lifted, and I was just there. Years have passed, and it has been over 8 years since my dad died. It's been a few months since he finally let go and moved on himself. Everything seems to be going well, and I hope that in whatever life there is after this, my dad can properly heal and go back to his old self. Now, I wish I could end this with a happier note, but there's something else. I'm not sure what happened with my dad. Was it a selfish wish from a little girl, or was it a father trying his hardest to watch over his family? I'm not quite sure. But since that day, I've been seeing more things. I want to help them. I do. But they look much worse than my dad. I Have to Hide When It Rains. Written by Darkheroxx, aka Anthony Lee. I hate it when it rains. The feeling of the air makes my skin crawl, and the pitter-pattering of the droplets pound in my ear. I fucking hate the rain. How it fills me of bad memories. Images of my grandfather cowering under the blankets. An adult man who fought in wars whimpering like a child as the sound of thunder shook the house. I'm so afraid of the rain because of what it brings. A monster. A curse. I was around 2 years old when my dad left. He just disappeared without saying a word to anyone. My mom did her best to take care of a baby while she was a kid herself. She was only 20 years old when she had me. She struggled so much because of me. Her parents had cut off all connections to her, but thankfully, my grandparents on my dad's side were so supportive of her. We were pretty lucky. They gave us a place to stay and took care of me while my mom worked her ass off to provide for me. Eventually, my mom was able to get a great job as a secretary for some lawyer, and we were able to get our own apartment. My mom is amazing. And when I was 6 years old, she decided to finish up her college education. It was hard for her to work, study, and raise a child, so My grandfather offered to take care of me every now and then. I remember how excited I was to see my grandfather's old truck pulling up to the school to come and get me. My grandmother had passed a couple of years before, so it was just us boys in that big house. I'd stay there after school, and my mom would come and pick me up later on that night. Things were awesome. Grandpa would always let me do whatever I wanted and tell me stories of when he was a soldier fighting in dark, rainy jungles. He'd call me his partner. Just us men against the world, he'd say. There was just one thing I always found a bit peculiar about my grandpa. He was terrified of the rain. I didn't really think much of it. He wouldn't pick me up on rainy days, though. It kind of inconvenienced my mom. When I was over there, while it started to rain, he would grab me and take me upstairs, locking us inside his bedroom closet. We'd sit there in the dark, and he would silently sob as he'd whisper, "It's okay, partner. We'll get through this. We'll get through this." As soon as the rain would stop, he'd take a moment to compose himself, and we'd go about the rest of our day like nothing ever happened. It was when I was 10 years old when I finally asked him, "Grandpa, what happens when it rains?" He paused and looked at me with sullen eyes. What do you mean, partner?" "When it rains, we always have to go upstairs in the closet. Even when it's just a little bit of water, we have to go in there." Grandpa looked outside, up towards the clouds. Despite it being a beautiful sunny afternoon, he let out a deep sigh. He turned back to me and finally answered me. "Come on, partner. Let's go sit on the couch so I can tell you a story." He slowly stepped towards the living room couch. I rushed over and grabbed his hand to help him. Grandpa was gaining some years, but when I grabbed his hand, he gripped it so tightly I felt a wave of nervousness. It took a minute, but we finally made it to the old pleather couch. Grandpa groaned as he took a seat. I shuffled up the couch to take a seat beside him. He chuckled and ruffled my hair. Grandpa's smile slowly faded as he started to stare off into the distance. His eyes began to glaze over. He looked at me and took a deep breath to prepare himself. Then he told me his story. You see, my grandpa was just a young man at the time, just turned 22 when he was sent off to Vietnam to fight. He'd used to tell me all kinds of heroic stories when I was growing up, but this story was different. His voice was low and shaky as he recounted the tale of his youth, a young soldier who had been fighting for his country. He was part of an infantry division. His group had caught wind of a nearby village that housed Viet Cong. They had been in the wilderness for days. The terrain was so difficult for them to deal with, and the battles they were forced to fight in the jungles had left them paranoid. My grandpa's hands were shaking at this point as he described how silent the night was. Not even their footsteps made noise. They were low on ammunition, as well as morale, but they trudged forward. They crept up to each of the huts and took out their lights, lit torches, and set everything ablaze. My grandpa began to cry at this point. He described the nauseating smell of smoke as the flames illuminated the dark clouds above them. He paused his story for a moment to cough uncontrollably. It was as if he was back to that dark night. I patted his back. Then he grabbed my hands and looked at me with his teary eyes and continued his tale. He was hesitant at first because I was so young, but he seemed determined to tell his truth. He told me that screams erupted from the crackling flames as people covered in roaring fire began to rush out of the huts. His platoon took advantage of the chaos and brandished their knives, finishing off the enemy one by one. The bodies were burning. Screams echoed. Then the cries of women and children began to flood their ears. My grandfather described standing there at the center of the village, slowly realizing their mistake. A woman came barreling out of their home as her body slowly burned. She slowly stepped towards my grandfather and yelled at him in a language he just didn't understand. My grandfather was horrified as she continued to yell at him until she finally collapsed to the ground. The cries and screams slowly subsided. Then the rumble of thunder came. Rain began to crash onto them. It was a monsoon. It came down so hard that the flames were quickly extinguished. The burning bodies were now piles of melted flesh, and when my grandfather looked at the woman, he realized she was holding something. He began to describe the nausea he felt, the pure guilt when he realized that she was holding the charred remains of a small baby. My grandfather began to choke up again and let out a disgusting cough. I was too young at the time, but I understood that he was in so much pain. All I could do was hug him as he began to sob. He tightened his arms around me. For a moment I couldn't breathe, but I endured for his sake and returned the hug with as much strength a child could muster. We sat there in silence for a moment until he whispered, "That isn't the worst part, partner. It got much worse." I felt my heart drop as I heard him say that. I tried to look at him, but he kept me tight in his arms. He whispered again, "That woman, she cursed me." Her words, like her flesh that night, were burned into my memories. I felt his body begin to shake as he continued. I inquired about what she said, and apparently she cursed me. She told me she would get her revenge on me and my men. I felt tears thump onto the top of my back as he finished his story. Every time it rains, she comes for us. One by one, my men began to fall. Every time the damn rain came. He groaned in pain as he said it. It didn't stop there. She wanted all of my men. She didn't want just them, and she won't stop at me either. He released me from his grasp and looked deep into my eyes. His eyes were filled with an unending sadness. She won't stop until she avenges her child too. She'll go to me, then to your daddy, then to you. And if you happen to make it by then, pray you don't have a son," he said, with such terror in his voice. I couldn't control it at that point. It was too much for a child like myself, and I burst into tears. My grandfather realized what he had done and did his best to distract my young mind to help me forget. He snapped back to normal, and he tried everything to help me forget. Well, I didn't forget. That story he had told me stuck with me for a long time. He told me to never tell my mom, and I didn't. I was too afraid to tell anyone. I wish I could tell you that was when the story ended, but this is where it will begin. It was that same year, a couple of months after he told me the story on a dark summer night. I was out of school, and my mom had started taking classes at night, so my grandpa suggested I stay over some nights. It was so much fun spending the night at my grandpa's house. We'd watch movies and eat tons of snacks. It was this one particular afternoon we were watching some cartoons on TV, and I guess we must have fallen asleep. I'm not sure how long we were out, but I was awoken by the sound of thunder. I looked around. The lights were off, and I could hear rain slowly dropping onto the old home. I placed a hand onto my grandpa's shoulder and tried to shake him awake. He stirred for a moment and slowly opened his eyes. He was about to ask me what time it was until he was interrupted by the rumble of thunder. Despite how dark the house was, I could see his eyes shoot wide open when he started to hear the rain. He grabbed my hand and tried his hardest to get up from the couch. I hopped off the couch and tried my best to pull him up. "Hurry, hurry, we have to go upstairs," he yelled. We made our way towards the stairs, and when he reached the bottom of the steps, the rain poured harder outside. The sound of the rushing water was almost deafening. I went a step ahead of my grandpa, holding his hand tightly as we tried to rush upstairs. We made it halfway up the stairs until Grandpa suddenly stopped moving. I turned to look at him, and I saw him looking down the stairs. Something was mixing with the sound of raindrops and thunder. It was a low, chirping noise, like something was making a cicada noise with a broken throat. I looked down towards the darkness. I couldn't see a thing until a crack of lightning illuminated the space around us. It was for a brief moment, but I saw at the foot of the stairwell a glimpse of a dark figure looking towards us. It was thin and naked, with dark, cracked skin. It stood there with its legs bent awkwardly and its neck tilted to one side. Its hair was long and wild, reaching their waist. It had one long arm hanging down while the other was clutching something to its chest. I was so afraid. I didn't know who this person was or how they got inside, but I called out to my grandpa, "Grandpa, Grandpa, please, we have to come up." I yelled, but he was just frozen in place. I felt his hand sweat and shake in my grasp. Lightning struck again, and as the room lit up, the figure had gotten a step closer. It was on the stairwell. I let out a scream as I took both hands to try and pull my grandpa up the stairs with me. The rain continued to come down, but that chirping sound, that disgusting, low thrum had gotten louder. Another flash of lightning, and again, it got closer this time. I could see that it was a woman. The woman was burned black head to toe. I could see bits of her charred flesh crack as she began to step closer and closer to us. I was just too small, too weak to pull my grandpa away from her. Suddenly, the lights began to flicker on and off, and I could see what the burnt woman was holding. It was small, naked in her charcoal arms, a melted, fleshy mass that looked towards me with two wide sockets of darkness for eyes and what appeared to be a toothless, open mouth. The noise was coming from the small thing. My grandpa let go of my hand and just stood there before them in a daze. I cried out to him again, but my yells were drowned out by a scream. It wasn't just one scream. It sounded as if dozens of people were crying out in pain. The lights flickered wildly like a strobe light in the room. Slowly, but surely, the woman pushed my grandpa down onto the steps of the stairs. She began to clamber onto him, and I heard him scream as I heard his old bones break upon impact. Her burned body was on top of my grandfather. The small, melted being squished onto my grandpa's chest and crawled towards his mouth. I sat there in awe as the small thing took its little hands and began to put them into my grandpa's mouth, going deeper into him. My grandpa tried to resist, but the burnt woman grabbed both of his arms and slammed him onto the stairs. I heard another nauseating crack of his bones, and he let out a muffled cry of agony. My grandpa began to choke and gag as the fleshy being began to dig inside of him, through his throat from his open mouth. I let out another cry, pleading with them to make it stop, but the little monster began to pull something out of my grandpa. It began to break open his mouth to carefully and meticulously pull out a beating red heart from his chest, up to his throat, and out of his fucking mouth. The woman slowly reached out to the thumping heart and grabbed it. It began to look at me with one eye through its long black hair. It pulled the heart towards its lips, and it opened its mouth wider and wider. It revealed sharp black teeth within the void of its mouth and sank them into the heart. It chewed, and the blood from it spilled onto the flesh baby. Its chirping turned into high-pitched squeals of delight as it reveled in the falling blood. As it finished chewing and devouring my poor grandpa's heart, it looked at me and licked the blood off its cracked lips. She picked up the baby and slowly got up. The lights finally flickered off again, and I stood there in pitch blackness. I heard something roll and thud down the stairs, and with another crack of lightning, the room illuminated to reveal my grandfather, bloodied and broken, at the bottom of the stairs. I fell backwards onto my butt and just sat there in the middle of the stairwell covered in tears, snot, and urine. I just sat there, staring at the lifeless corpse of my grandpa for hours until the rain finally stopped. My mother came and found the state that we were in. She released such a blood-curdling scream, but it didn't shake me. I just stood there. The diagnosis was that my grandpa had a heart attack and fell down the stairs. Needless to say, it took a lot of therapy to deal with what happened that night. It took years and years, but slowly I was able to, at the very least, cope with it. And whenever it rains, I turn into a frantic mess as I try my best to hide from something. My mom just couldn't stop worrying about me. She pushed everything aside to stick with me through all of it. Then I became a young man. Now I'm in my late 20s, and I'm just trying to make sense of what I saw that rainy night. It really messed me up. Even now, I have to skip work if it rains. I dash to a bathroom stall or something and lock myself in. I got some news the other day, though. Apparently, my father had been found in the middle of the street across the country. It was raining when he had a heart attack, and he ran in front of a car. I'm not sure what to do next, but hopefully those things won't find me. It began to sprinkle the other day, and I saw something creeping outside my window. Whatever it is, it's not done. It won't be done until it takes all of my grandpa's men. I'm afraid to end up like them. I'm afraid to see those things again. I'm so afraid of the rain.